In the spring of 1869, a crew of laborers climbed to the top of a hill in the middle of St. Louis, Missouri, and started taking it apart with shovels, picks, and horse carts. The thing they were dismantling was not really a hill. It was 319 feet long, more than 30 feet tall, and it had been sitting on the bluff above the Mississippi River for somewhere between 400 and 800 years before the first European ever laid eyes on it. The people of the city called it Big Mound, and it was the reason St. Louis had a nickname long before it had a single skyscraper. They called it Mound City. By the end of that year, Big Mound was gone. Not damaged, not relocated. Gone. Carted away wheelbarrow by wheelbarrow, and the dirt that had been piled there by human hands centuries earlier was sold off and packed under the tracks of the North Missouri Railroad. The largest ancient monument in the city was turned into roadbed. And here, I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Is the part that should stop you cold. Big Mound was not alone. It was the biggest of a cluster of around 26 earthen mounds that once stood along the northern riverfront of St. Louis. Some sources counted even more. By the year 1904, almost every single one of them had been erased from the map, flattened, ploughed, quarried for fill, built over. Today, out of the entire group, exactly one survives inside the city, and it only survived by accident. So this is the question we are going to sit inside for the next half hour. How does a city lose 26 ancient monuments and barely notice? Why did nobody stop it? And why, more than 150 years later, do so many people look at the photographs of those vanished mounds and refuse to believe the official story of what they were? Because something about this case does not sit right. It never has. Let us go back to the beginning, before the shovels. Long before there was a France or a Spain laying claim to this stretch of river, the land that would become Saint Louis was already the edge of something enormous. Just across the Mississippi, on the Illinois side, stood a city called Cahokia. And calling it a city is not an exaggeration to make the story sound bigger. At its peak, around the year 1100, Cahokia held a population estimated to rival or exceed the London of that same century. It was the largest concentration of people anywhere in what is now the United States, and it would hold that record until Philadelphia finally passed it more than 600 years later. The people who built it left behind earthworks on a scale that is genuinely hard to picture. The largest of them, Monk's Mound, covers more ground at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. These were the Mississippians. We use that word as a label of convenience, because they did not leave us their own name for themselves in any language we can read. What they left instead was earth, shaped, stacked, flattened, and aligned earth, spread across the middle of the continent from Wisconsin down to the Gulf of Mexico, and street. Louis, on the western bank, was not some empty overflow lot. It was part of the same complex. So much so that early travelers gave the area a second nickname. They called the three places together: Cahokia, East St. Louis, and St. Louis itself, the central political and spiritual heart of a civilization. St. Louis was the western anchor of all of it. And the scale of it deserves a moment, because most people have simply never been told. At its height, around the year 1100, Cahokia and its satellite communities may have held 20,000 people or more in a single connected settlement. There were distinct neighborhoods. There were open plazas the size of dozens of football fields, deliberately engineered flat, with millions of baskets of earth moved by hand to level the ground. There were enormous circles of upright wooden posts aligned to the movements of the sun, structures researchers now call woodhenges, built to track the solstices and the equinoxes with real precision. And presiding over everything, Monk's Mound rose in great terraces toward a building set on its summit, the seat of whoever ruled this place. None of this involved the wheel. None of it involved draft animals or metal tools. It was all accomplished with baskets, muscle, and an organization of human labor so disciplined that it permanently reshaped the geography of the river valley. That is the world St. Louis was built on top of, not a wilderness, the ruins of a metropolis. When the French arrived in the 1700s, the mounds were already old. Nobody living nearby could tell them exactly who had built these things or precisely when. The builders had dispersed centuries earlier for reasons that are still debated today. Drought, flooding, political collapse, disease, resource exhaustion, all of these have been proposed, and the honest answer is that we still do not fully know why Cahokia emptied out. But the monuments stayed, silent, grass-covered, enormous, and impossible to ignore. And that silence, that absence of a written explanation, is where the whole problem begins. Picture what the founders of St. Louis actually saw when they arrived. They saw a young city laid out on a grid, and rising above that grid, a series of massive geometric earthworks. Big Mound itself had a flat top wide enough to stand a crowd on, and from up there you could see the river bending for miles. Steamboat pilots used it as a landmark. Artists climbed it to paint the view. There was a smaller group nearby that locals nicknamed the Falling Garden because of the way it terraced down toward the water. There was one mound so symmetrical and cone-shaped that they leveled it specifically to build a water reservoir on the spot. In other words, the people of St. Louis lived among these things every single day. They named streets after them. Mound Street is still on the map. They named their newspapers, their insurance companies, their social clubs after them. Mound City this, Mound City that. The mounds were not some hidden secret buried under the soil. They were the most prominent features of the landscape, and the city wore them like a crown. So how do you go from wearing something like a crown to selling it for railroad dirt in a single generation? The simple answer is money, and the simple answer is true, but it is not the whole answer. To understand it, you have to understand what was happening to St. Louis in the middle of the 1800s. The city was exploding. Steamboats had turned the riverfront into one of the busiest commercial corridors on the continent. Then came the railroads, hungry for land, hungry for level ground, and hungry above all for fill dirt to raise their grades above the floodplain. And there, sitting right on the most valuable real estate in the city, on the bluff overlooking the water, were these inconvenient ancient hills full of perfectly good, pre-dug, ready to haul earth. To a railroad engineer in 1868, Big Mound was not a monument. It was a free quarry in the exact spot he needed cleared. It is worth slowing down on the economics here, because this is the point where the story stops being a tragedy of ignorance and becomes something colder and far more deliberate. Raising a railroad grade above the Mississippi floodplain required staggering volumes of fill dirt. Normally you pay to dig it, you pay to haul it, and the distance between where you find the dirt and where you actually need it is one of the largest costs in the entire operation. Big Mound solved that problem perfectly. It was a pre-assembled hill of clean, compacted earth, sitting directly on the route, on land that developers and the railroad wanted cleared anyway. Every cubic yard hauled out of it was a cubic yard the company did not have to purchase or transport from somewhere else. The monument was not just an obstacle in the way of progress. It was a subsidy. Demolishing it paid for itself twice over. Once by clearing prime riverfront real estate for sale and development, and once by handing the railroad its construction material for free. In pure ledger terms, leaving Big Mound standing would have cost the city money. Tearing it down made money. And in the St. Louis of 1868, that single calculation was the only one that carried any weight. That is the uncomfortable core of this whole episode. The mounds were not destroyed by people who failed to understand their value. They were destroyed by people who understood value with total precision and decided that these particular monuments had the wrong kind of it. The destruction did not happen all at once, and that is part of why it slipped by. It happened the way these things usually happen, gradually, then suddenly. Workers had been gouging chunks out of the smaller mounds since the 1830s as the city pushed northward. The Falling Garden was mostly gone by the early 1840s. People dug into Big Mound itself starting in the 1850s, slicing off pieces to widen a street here, level a lot there. The reservoir mound came down in 1856. Each cut was small enough to seem reasonable. Each one made the next one easier. Then, in November of 1868, the final demolition of Big Mound began in earnest, to feed the North Missouri Railroad. And this time there was no stopping it. There is one man we have to thank for the fact that we can see any of this with our own eyes. His name was Thomas Easterly, a daguerreotype photographer working in St. Louis in the 1850s. Easterly pointed his camera at Big Mound while it still stood whole, capturing it as a real, physical thing in the landscape. And then, years later, he photographed it again as the crews ate it away, recording the cuttings and the shrinking remains. His images are among the only direct visual records that survive of the mound as something that genuinely existed, not a painting, not a memory, but a photograph. Look at them, and the abstraction collapses. This was here. People stood on it, and a row of labourers with carts took it down to nothing, while a man with a camera quietly recorded the last of it disappearing. There is something almost unbearable about those plates. They function as a monument's death certificate, the only proof in some cases that the thing was ever there to lose. A few people did try. A local newspaper, the Daily Missouri Democrat, ran a line on the 8th of November, 1868, that reads like a warning shouted into a hurricane. The writer said that men were digging on every side, and that what should have been bought by the city and preserved untouched would soon be known only in tradition. Soon be known only in tradition. That is a newspaper, in real time, watching the city erase its own oldest landmark and admitting that within a few years there would be nothing left but a story. And they were almost right. There is barely even a story. Another paper put it more bluntly. It described what was driving the whole thing as the grasping money-making spirit of the age. Not ignorance, not accident. The grasping money-making spirit of the age. The people doing the recording understood exactly what was being traded away, and exactly what it was being traded for. A monument older than most of Europe's cathedrals, exchanged for the cost of fill dirt under a train track. Now here is where the story takes the turn that keeps people up at night. When the crews cut into Big Mound, they did not find an empty pile of dirt. Inside, archaeologists and curiosity seekers found a burial chamber. Estimates put the number of individuals interred there at somewhere between 20 and 32 people. One of the burials was reportedly 25 feet below the surface, sealed inside the structure. And around the bones they found objects that should make anyone reconsider the idea that this was some primitive backwater. They found beads and ornaments made from marine shell that came from the Gulf of Mexico, hundreds of miles to the south. They found copper. They found what some accounts described as ear ornaments and decorative pieces, the kind of grave goods you bury with people who mattered. Think about what that means. These objects are proof of a trade network that stretched across half a continent. Copper from the north, shells from the southern sea, all converging on this one spot on the Mississippi, all worked into ornaments and placed with the honored dead inside a monument that took an unimaginable amount of coordinated human labor to build. This was not the work of a few wandering families. This was the work of an organized society, with reach, with craft, and with a sense of the sacred. And the way all of this came out of the ground tells you everything about how little that sacredness counted in 1869. The demolition of Big Mound was not a careful archaeological excavation. It was a public spectacle. As the crews cut deeper and word spread that there were human bones and worked ornaments inside, curiosity seekers came down to pick through the rubble for themselves. People carried off fragments as souvenirs. What should have been the single most significant archaeological recovery in the city's history was instead a crowd scene at a working quarry, with the remains of the honored dead scattered into private pockets and the surrounding earth shoveled onto carts bound for the railroad. There was no plan to preserve or study the structure, only to load it onto carts and haul it all off, and then most of it was lost. This is the detail that genuinely haunts the whole episode. The artifacts pulled from Big Mound were not carefully catalogued and protected. They scattered. Some pieces were handed off to a local scientific academy, the Academy of Science of St. Louis, in that very same year, 1869. That academy's building burned down. Other artifacts ended up at a university where, By some accounts, the famous copper ear ornaments were quite literally lost after being shoved into a janitor's closet and forgotten. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment now, then come back. There exists somewhere in the historical record a photograph of some of these objects, and it was only rediscovered by chance in the 1950s, sitting in a list at a museum across the country. The objects themselves, the physical proof, mostly cannot be located at all today, so let us add it up. An entire group of ancient monuments, demolished. The human remains inside them, disturbed and dispersed. The artifacts that survived the demolition, scattered, burned, mislaid, or stuffed in a closet. And the written explanation of who built them and why, never fully recorded in the first place, because the builders were gone before the city even formed. If you wanted to erase a civilization from a place, you could not design a more thorough method, and whether or not anyone intended it, that is functionally what happened. This is the point where the alternative theories come in, and we are going to deal with them honestly, because pretending they do not exist would be dishonest, and so would pretending they are something they are not. Go online and look up the St. Louis Mounds, and before long you will run into a much bigger and stranger idea. You will find people arguing that these mounds, and earthworks like them all over the world, are not what mainstream history says they are at all. You will hear talk of a lost global civilization, sometimes given the name Tartaria, an empire supposedly so advanced and so deliberately erased that almost no trace of it was allowed to survive in the official record. In that telling, the destruction of monuments like Big Mound is not careless greed. It is a cover-up, a deliberate program to wipe out the evidence of a world that came before, and to replace its real history with a tamer, more convenient story. It is worth understanding why this idea grabs people, because the appeal is not stupid. The appeal is actually rooted in something completely real. People look at the historical record around these mounds and they sense, correctly, that something is missing. They are right that the official treatment of these sites was careless to the point of cruelty. They are right that the evidence was scattered and destroyed. They are right that you were probably never taught any of this in school, even though a civilization that rivaled medieval London once stood on American soil. When you have been left in the dark about something this big, and then you discover it was bulldozed for train tracks and stuffed in a closet, the feeling that someone is hiding something is not irrational. It is the natural response to a genuine absence. But here is where we have to be careful, because the absence is real and the explanation matters enormously. The hardest and most important fact about the St. Louis Mounds is the one that was contested for the longest time, and it is this: they were built by Native Americans, specifically by the Mississippian peoples, ancestors of nations who are still here today, including the Osage, who in our own century purchased and now protect the one surviving mound in the city. That sentence sounds obvious now. For most of the 1800s, it was anything but obvious in the minds of the settlers, because there was a powerful and widely believed alternative story circulating at the time. And that story is the real cover-up in this case, just not the one most people expect. It was called the myth of the mound builders. Through the 1700s and 1800s, enormous numbers of white Americans simply refused to accept that the ancestors of the native peoples they were in the process of dispossessing could have built monuments this sophisticated, so they invented a vanished race. The mounds, they argued, must have been the work of some lost civilization, perhaps Israelites, perhaps Vikings, perhaps survivors of Atlantis, perhaps a mysterious white people who came first and were then wiped out by the ancestors of modern Native Americans. You can see what that story does. It is not idle speculation. It hands the moral high ground to the people taking the land. If the Indians had themselves destroyed an earlier, nobler civilization, then taking the continent from them was not conquest. It was justice. The myth of a lost master race was a tool, and it did real work. It took decades of actual archaeology to kill that myth. In the 1880s and 90s, a researcher named Cyrus Thomas, working for the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology, was assigned to settle the mound builder question once and for all. He and his team surveyed and excavated mounds across the country, and the conclusion was unambiguous. The mounds were built by the ancestors of living Native Americans. There was no vanished foreign master race. There never had been. The greatest earthwork civilization north of Mexico was indigenous, full stop, and St. Louis was not unique in any of this. The same scene played out across the entire eastern half of the country through the 18 and early 1900s. Tens of thousands of mounds and earthworks, some of them vast geometric complexes that stretched for miles across the land, were ploughed under for farmland, quarried for road material, looted for relics to sell, or simply graded away to make room for towns. An entire landscape of monumental architecture, the largest body of ancient construction anywhere in North America, vanished into fields and foundations, mostly without ceremony and almost entirely without record. What happened on the St. Louis riverfront was not an aberration or an accident of one greedy decade. It was the local edition of a continental erasure, repeated in county after county until the official map of America looked the way the official story needed it to look, empty before the settlers came, a blank page waiting to be written on. So now you can see the strange shape of the whole thing clearly. There genuinely is a buried civilization in this story. There genuinely was an erasure. There genuinely is a powerful false narrative that replaced the truth. But the buried civilization is the Mississippians. The erasure was physical demolition driven by profit and excused by prejudice, and the false narrative was not invented to hide an advanced, lost empire. It was invented to deny credit to the actual builders, because admitting the truth was inconvenient for the people taking their land. When modern lost civilization theories pick up the St. Louis mounds and fold them into a tale about Tartaria or any other vanished superculture, they are, without meaning to, doing the same thing the mound builder myth did in the 1800s. They are taking a Native American achievement and assigning it to someone else. They feel like they are uncovering a hidden truth. In practice, they are reaching for an old lie, wearing new clothes. And the people who have fought the hardest to protect what little remains, the descendant nations, are the ones erased a second time when that happens. That is why this case matters so much more than a simple story about old dirt. The question of who built the mounds is not academic. It decided how an entire continent's history would be told and to whom it would be credited. Because Big Mound was only the most famous casualty, not the last one, the destruction did not end in 1869. It continued, methodically, for another generation, until the map was finally clean. Mounds that had stood at street corners came down to make way for buildings. A mound on the grounds of a college in the north of the city was levelled. Another, sitting at the intersection of two ordinary streets, was scraped flat and forgotten. And, in one of the bleakest ironies in the whole story, a cluster of mounds that had managed to survive out in what became Forest Park was ploughed under to prepare the grounds for the 1904 World's Fair. That was the great exposition where St. Louis presented its grand vision of human progress and the future to the entire planet. Human remains were reportedly disturbed in the process, near the spot where the city's art museum stands to this day. They flattened genuine ancient American monuments in order to build a temporary celebration of civilization and advancement. By the time the fair opened its gates, of the roughly 24 mounds that had given the city its name, virtually every single one was gone. So what actually remains? Of the roughly 24 mounds that gave Mound City its name, one is left inside St. Louis. It is called Sugarloaf Mound, sitting at the southern edge of where the great group once stood, on the bluff above the river. For most of the last century, there was literally a house built on top of it, a private residence sitting on a sacred monument, which tells you almost everything about how these places were regarded. Then, in 2009, the Osage Nation bought back a piece of their own ancestors' work, with plans to remove the house, restore the mound, and protect it. It is the only one. Out of all of them, It survived because someone happened to build a home on it instead of a railroad, and because a nation refused to let the last one go. Sugarloaf is not large by the standard of what once stood here. It is a modest rise compared to the giant that Big Mound used to be. But standing in its presence means something precisely because of everything around it that is now missing. It is the last witness. When the Osage Nation purchased it, they were not simply acquiring a piece of real estate. They were reclaiming the final physical link between the living descendants of the Mississippian world and the place their ancestors had shaped with their own hands. Every other thread had been cut. This one was held onto by inches. And the plain fact that protecting a single ancient monument in a major American city required a sovereign native nation to literally buy back the house sitting on top of it tells you how completely the original meaning of these places had been buried. Long before anyone on the internet ever started speculating about lost empires and secret cataclysms, Big Mound itself is marked today by almost nothing. For years there was a boulder with a plaque near where it once stood. And even that small memorial carries the strangeness of this whole story, because when it was first installed, in 1929, it was sponsored by a settler heritage organization, and the wording honored the city's founders more than the people who actually built the mound and were buried inside it. The monument to the erasure managed to repeat the erasure. The boulder has since been moved, shuffled aside, fittingly enough, to make room for the construction of a bridge. Stand on that spot now, and there is nothing to see. A road, some rail infrastructure, the river going by the way it always has. You would never know that for centuries this was one of the most significant ceremonial landscapes on the continent, or that the largest monument in the city stood right here within the memory of people whose grandchildren are still alive. And maybe that is the real reason this story refuses to stay buried. No pun intended. Not because of a secret empire, because of a simple, documented, and genuinely uncomfortable fact. A great civilization stood here. It built things meant to outlast everyone. And then, in the span of a few decades, a younger city took those things apart and sold them, partly for profit, partly because admitting what they were would have meant admitting too much. The mounds were not lost to time or to some mysterious cataclysm. They were lost to a railroad grade, a real estate boom, and a story people told themselves so they would not have to feel the weight of what they were destroying, the grasping, money-making spirit of the age. That is what one of their own newspapers called it, while it was happening, in plain print. There is a strange comfort in conspiracy, because a conspiracy implies that someone, somewhere, was at least powerful enough and organized enough to be in control of all this. The truth is harder and quieter, and in its own way, far darker. No secret council ordered the mounds destroyed. They came down because 100 ordinary decisions, each one driven by a little bit of money and a little bit of indifference, added up to the deletion of something irreplaceable. Nobody had to conspire. They only had to not care. And that is a thing that can happen anywhere, to anything, including to whatever your own city decides is worth less than the ground it sits on. Imagine, for a moment, the St. Louis that chose differently. A city that bought Big Mound when its own newspaper begged it to, that fenced off the cluster and let the largest ancient monument north of Mexico stand in the heart of downtown, the way Rome lets its ruins stand.